Hi, my name is Hannah Preston. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Scottsdale, Arizona. And if you were to meet me on the street, you'd probably never guess that I've spent most of my life trying to prove something to a man who only saw what I lacked. Growing up in the Preston household wasn't what you'd call warm. Our house was large, spotless, and cold, literally and emotionally. My father, Douglas Preston, was a senior VP at one of the most prestigious real estate firms in Arizona. He carried himself like a war general, commanding, proud, always polished. My mother, Judith, was more of a shadow than a woman, always 2 steps behind him, never speaking out of turn. My younger brother, Jeremy, was the golden child. He played football, got average grades, but always managed to shine in my father's eyes, even when he messed up. I, on the other hand, graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship, and started my own business by the time I was 26. Yet somehow, that was never enough. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories like mine resonate with you, don't forget to like and subscribe to see how standing up for yourself can change everything. My dad used to say things like, "You're book smart, Hannah, but you lack instinct," or "Success isn't about degrees. It's about grit, and you don't have it." That was his way of motivating me, I guess. At least that's what my mother always said when I cried myself to sleep. But to me, it just felt like rejection wrapped in a suit and tie. The strange part is, I never hated him. I wanted to, but I didn't. I just kept trying harder, thinking that one day, maybe he'd look at me the way he looked at Jeremy. That one day, I'd finally be enough. But all that changed on a Thursday afternoon in early June. That was the day of his retirement party. He had worked for 42 years at Keller and Gates Realty. They held the party in a luxury banquet hall just outside Old Town Scottsdale. It was elegant, filled with soft jazz music, polished wood floors, and too many white-haired men in tailored suits laughing about golf. I hadn't planned to go. I hadn't even received a personal invitation. But my mother begged me, and despite everything, I still wanted to believe that maybe this time he'd acknowledge me. Maybe in front of everyone, his colleagues, his clients, his friends, he would say, "That's my daughter, Hannah. She made me proud." I wore a deep blue dress, heels that pinched a little too much, and a carefully composed smile. I brought a small bouquet of lilies, his favorite, and tucked a letter inside, one I had rewritten a dozen times. In it, I told him how much I respected his work ethic, how he shaped my drive, and how, despite the silence between us, I carried pieces of him in everything I did. The hall was buzzing when I arrived. There were people clinking glasses, servers floating around with trays of champagne and mini crab cakes. I spotted Jeremy near the bar, laughing with some guy in a golf shirt, and I made my way to my mom. She smiled, genuinely happy to see me, her eyes already glossed with pride and stress. "Your father will be surprised," she whispered. "I'm glad you came." He was called to the stage about halfway through the night. The applause was thunderous, and even I found myself clapping, caught in the wave of it. He looked sharp, as always. Navy suit, perfectly combed silver hair, a confident smile that hadn't changed since I was 5. He started his speech with charm, reminiscing about his first day at the firm, thanking his colleagues, cracking a few jokes. The crowd was engaged. Then, as he neared the end, he took a long pause. I remember the way he looked out across the room, his eyes scanning, then narrowing slightly. My heart started racing. "And, of course," he said, "I couldn't have done all this without the support of my family. My wife, Judith, the rock who stood by me every step of the way, and my son, Jeremy, who I know will carry the Preston name forward with strength and integrity. He's everything a father could hope for." People clapped. My throat tightened. He continued without even glancing at me. "As for my daughter, well, Hannah's always marched to the beat of her own drum. Brilliant, yes, but complicated. Let's just say we never quite saw eye to eye, but I suppose that's life. Not every seed you plant grows the way you expect." There was a ripple in the room, uneasy laughter from some, awkward silence from others. I froze. My ears were ringing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He didn't just ignore me. He reduced me, in front of everyone. After everything I had done to try to earn his respect, he turned me into a punchline. I left the bouquet on the gift table without the letter. My hands were shaking. My jaw locked so tightly I thought I might crack a molar. I drove home in silence, the words replaying in my mind like a cruel soundtrack. That night, something inside me shifted. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, replaying every time he had dismissed me, every time he had ignored my achievements, every time he chose silence instead of support. For years, I thought if I just kept pushing, he'd eventually see me. But that night, I realized he never wanted to, and something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to write letters or show up to prove myself. I was going to show him exactly what I had become, and I was going to make sure he never forgot it. So I started planning, not out of hate, but out of clarity. Cold, precise, deliberate clarity. If he wanted to bury me under silence, I would build something so loud, so undeniable that even he couldn't ignore it. I knew exactly what his weakness was, his legacy, his name, his reputation. He cared more about that than anything else. So I would use it. I would make sure that his final bow, the image he had spent 4 decades polishing, would be remembered for what he truly was. Not the composed executive everyone respected, but the father who couldn't see the treasure sitting right in front of him. And I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw a fit. I was going to give him a gift, a farewell gift he would never forget. The day after the retirement party, I woke up feeling hollow but electric, like I was living in the echo of a storm. The pain of what happened still pulsed behind my ribs, but underneath it, something else had awakened. It was a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to gain his approval. I was preparing to expose the truth, not just for myself, but for every time someone like me had been diminished, dismissed, or made invisible by someone they loved. I didn't talk to anyone about what I was planning. Not my mother, not my friends, not even Jeremy. Especially not Jeremy. Because as much as my father had always favored him, Jeremy had never really known what that favoritism cost. He believed the family story my father had written, that I was difficult, aloof, too independent to be reached. He never asked what it felt like to be talked over at every dinner table, to be told to calm down whenever I expressed an opinion, or to be forgotten in moments that were supposed to belong to all of us. I began my research quietly. I started by gathering every public interview, article, and press release my father had ever been part of. I studied his tone, his language, the image he curated. He was the embodiment of stability and success, the man who built a real estate empire with integrity. That's what people believed. That's what he had sold for years. But behind closed doors, I knew the cracks in that image. I remembered how he used to talk about his clients, calling them idiots with deep pockets. I remembered the under-the-table deals he bragged about when he thought no one was listening. I remembered the whispers I overheard late at night, names of people he paid off, favors he exchanged, and corners he cut. The real breakthrough came when I revisited my late uncle's storage unit. My Uncle Martin, Dad's younger brother, had passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack. He and my father were close in business but distant in every other way. Martin was quieter, more thoughtful, and unlike my dad, he kept records of everything. After his death, his storage unit had been boxed up and mostly forgotten, but I still had access. I went there one afternoon with a notebook, unsure of what I'd find. What I discovered changed everything. Inside one of the crates were old ledgers, paper trails of transactions, names of clients, lists of properties bought under false names. Some pages had my father's handwriting, others were signed by proxies. It didn't take a forensic analyst to see what they were. Tax evasion, property laundering, a shell company or two. There it was, the polished man of principle hiding behind a mask. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. All this time, while he had been judging me for my choices, for not being like him, this was who he truly was. A fraud in a $1,000 suit. I scanned everything. I backed it up. I organized it into a timeline. And then I crafted a message. Not one of vengeance for the sake of destruction, but of justice. If he wanted to reduce me to a footnote in his story, I would write an entirely new book. Still, I wasn't ready to move yet. Timing mattered, and impact required precision. Meanwhile, I kept showing up to family events. I smiled when my mother asked how my business was going. I laughed at Jeremy's jokes, even when I wanted to scream. I played the part of the daughter who had accepted her place in the shadows, because no one suspects a woman who's already been dismissed. Then came the news that my father was being honored at the Arizona Real Estate Legacy Awards. It was the first time the ceremony would include a televised segment and a live audience beyond industry insiders. The event was scheduled to be held at the Scottsdale Civic Center, in front of an audience of over 400 professionals, community leaders, and press members. The honoree would give a final speech, his closing legacy message. It was poetic, too poetic to ignore. I reached out to a former journalism professor of mine, someone who now worked as a freelance investigative reporter. I didn't give my name at first. I simply sent her scanned documents, carefully selected from the files I had found. I asked her what she would do if she had proof of a public figure hiding financial misconduct. She called me within an hour. "This is big," she said. "But if we move on this, we do it clean. Verified sources, confirmation, legal protection. Are you in?" I told her I was, but I needed one thing: timing. "Give me until after the Legacy Awards," I said. "Let him speak. Let him think he won. Then we show the truth." She hesitated. "That's risky." "I know," I said, "but it has to be that way." While she verified documents and followed paper trails, I prepared my final act. I created a short video, 3 minutes long. In it, I narrated the truth over images of scanned documents, property records, and old photographs. I didn't mention his name outright, but anyone watching would know. The voiceover was calm, deliberate, painfully honest. It ended with a simple question: what kind of legacy do we honor when we refuse to look beneath the surface? I scheduled it for release the night of the awards, synced to go live the moment his final speech concluded. The evening arrived, and I dressed carefully, not to impress but to stand firm. I wore black, sleek, elegant, no nonsense. My mother was glowing with excitement. She clutched my father's arm like she used to do when they were newlyweds. Jeremy was beaming, already bragging to someone from the Chamber of Commerce about how he planned to follow in Dad's footsteps. And Dad? He looked like royalty, like a man about to be immortalized. I sat quietly during the ceremony, every nerve in my body on fire. The MC told stories of Dad's career, praised his unshakable moral compass, and presented a plaque engraved with his name. Then, as the audience stood to applaud, he took the stage for his final address. He began by thanking everyone, of course: my mother, Jeremy, colleagues, mentors. He even joked about the early days when he was just a kid trying to sell dream homes with nothing but a used car and a cheap suit. The audience chuckled. He stood tall, confident, self-assured. And then he did something unexpected. "I'd also like to acknowledge my daughter, Hannah," he said, turning slightly toward where I sat. "She's always been strong-willed. Challenging, yes, but brilliant in her own way. I suppose every father has to learn to appreciate the differences in his children." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't affection. It was a political nod, a performance for the cameras, as if a single sentence could wipe away a lifetime of erasure. But I didn't flinch. I smiled, and when the applause came, I clapped like everyone else, because I knew what was about to happen. Backstage, moments later, as he basked in congratulations and champagne, my video went live. It spread fast, first through local journalists, then on Twitter, and finally into the inboxes of several real estate boards and regulatory bodies. The reporter I had worked with published her exposé 30 minutes later, with corroborated evidence and a full investigative breakdown. By midnight, phones were ringing, news vans were circling, and Douglas Preston's carefully curated image was cracking under the weight of truth. I didn't do it to destroy him. I did it to reclaim myself. He gave his legacy a stage. I gave it a spotlight, and the show was only just beginning. The morning after the awards ceremony, the sun rose over Scottsdale with the same soft glow it always did, casting golden light through the blinds of my bedroom window. But the world outside was different now. I could feel it. The silence was deceptive. My father hadn't called. No one had. Not even my mother. But I knew it was coming. The kind of silence that settles just before a landslide. I opened my laptop and saw it immediately. The video had gone viral overnight, 50,000 views and climbing. The article my contact had published was gaining traction too. It wasn't just local news anymore. National blogs were picking it up, echoing headlines like Arizona real estate icon accused of years-long financial misconduct and retired VP at center of scandal hours after legacy award speech. The contrast between the two moments, the applause, the spotlight, and now this unraveling, was so stark, it felt almost surreal. But I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. There was a tremor in my chest, a kind of ache that I hadn't expected. Because while my father had never treated me like a daughter to be proud of, he was still my father. And as much as this was about justice, about finally being seen, part of me still mourned what could have been. The girl who once longed for his approval hadn't fully disappeared. She was just learning to live without illusions. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I hesitated before answering. I was bracing for tears, for anger, maybe even betrayal. But when I picked up, her voice was quiet, tired. "Hannah," she said, "what did you do?" I closed my eyes, taking a breath. I told the truth. There was a long pause. Then she said, "He hasn't slept. He's been on the phone all night. Lawyers, board members, friends trying to understand. He feels humiliated." "I know," I said, my tone steady. "And maybe now he understands how I've felt my entire life." She sighed, but didn't argue. "He says he wants to talk to you. In person." That surprised me. I expected avoidance, denial, maybe a legal threat. Not this, but I agreed, because part of me still needed to look him in the eye, not for closure, but for confrontation. We met that evening at their house, my childhood home, the same one where he had criticized my every move, where family dinners had felt like interviews I always failed. He was sitting in the living room, not in his usual posture of command, but slouched, disheveled. He had aged overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed, and for the first time in my life, I saw him not as a monument, but as a man, flawed, human, unraveling. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me. I held his gaze. "You did this," he said, voice low. "You ruined me." "No," I said, walking in slowly. "You ruined yourself. I just stopped covering for it." He flinched. "You had no right." "I had every right," I snapped. "For years you stood on stages and accepted praise built on lies. And in the middle of all that, you tore me down. Over and over again. I spent years thinking if I just tried harder, if I just succeeded louder, you might see me. But you didn't want a daughter. You wanted a mirror. Someone to reflect the version of yourself you liked best." He rubbed his forehead, his voice brittle. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. I did what I had to do for this family." "No," I said. "You did what you had to do for your image. Don't confuse the two." My mother stood at the doorway, silent, arms crossed. She didn't defend him. She didn't defend me. She just listened. And maybe that was enough. "You blindsided me," he said finally, in front of everyone. "You timed it to hurt me." "No," I said, calmer now. "I timed it so you couldn't spin it, so you couldn't call it exaggeration or rebellion or bitterness. You made me invisible for 28 years, Dad. I made sure this time you couldn't ignore me." He looked away then. Not because he was ashamed. I don't think he was capable of that. But because he couldn't control the narrative anymore. He couldn't reshape my words into something that served him. And that loss of power, that terrified him more than any accusation ever could. "I don't know what you expect from me now," he muttered. "Nothing," I said. "Not an apology, not forgiveness. Just this moment, just the truth sitting between us for once." He didn't respond, and I didn't need him to. I turned and left, my heart beating like a drum in my ears. That was the last time I saw him for a while. In the weeks that followed, the fallout escalated. The firm he had retired from released a statement distancing themselves from him. An investigation was opened into financial misconduct spanning 2 decades. Former clients came forward. A civil suit was filed. His legacy award was quietly rescinded. And the silence that followed wasn't like before. It wasn't the silence of neglect or dismissal. It was the silence of consequence, of reckoning. Jeremy called me 2 weeks later. He was furious at first. defensive, accusatory, but eventually the cracks showed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Why didn't you say it had gotten this bad?" "Because you never listened," I said. "And because I needed to stop explaining myself to people who only hear what they want to." He didn't respond, and we haven't spoken since. The strangest part was how much lighter I felt. I expected the aftermath to be heavy, to weigh me down with guilt or second-guessing. But instead, I felt like I could finally breathe, like I had been carrying a burden so long I forgot what it meant to stand straight. I poured myself into my business. I expanded, hired a small team, moved into a new office downtown. People who once saw me as Doug Preston's odd daughter began to recognize me for my work. For the first time, my name stood on its own. And yet, there were moments, quiet mornings, certain songs on the radio, the smell of his old cologne on a stranger, that still triggered a pang, not of regret, but of memory. The part of me that still wondered what it would have been like to have a father who saw me, who championed me, who didn't flinch at my strength but celebrated it. That part may never fully vanish, but I stopped letting that ache define me. Months passed. The news cycle moved on. My father faded into a kind of social exile, no longer invited to charity events, no longer featured on glossy magazine spreads. He became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and cocktail parties. And I kept going. I didn't destroy him out of hate. I exposed him because I couldn't live under the weight of his shadow anymore. And in doing so, I finally stepped into my own light. The strange thing about taking back your power is that once you do, everything else begins to rearrange itself around the new version of who you are. In the months that followed the public fallout with my father, I started to see life through a clearer lens, not clouded by the desperate need for approval or the constant fear of being too much or not enough. I wasn't chasing anyone anymore, not even closure. I was building something new, something mine. I had always been ambitious, but now, that ambition felt grounded. Before, it came from a place of trying to prove myself. Now, it came from a place of knowing who I was and what I was capable of. I invested more deeply in my company, Preston and Willow Creative, which had started as a freelance design agency and was now evolving into a full-service branding firm. We began taking on larger clients, tech startups in Phoenix, wellness brands in Sedona, and even a few small fashion labels out of Los Angeles. I hired 2 junior designers, a copywriter, and a project manager. The energy in the office shifted. There was laughter, late nights brainstorming over coffee and takeout, and that electric thrill of watching something you've built come alive. Every now and then, someone would ask if I was that Hannah Preston. I never denied it. I didn't flaunt it either. I let my work speak louder than my past. But there was something satisfying in knowing that I didn't need anyone else's name to validate my own anymore. My relationship with my mother grew more complicated in that time. At first, she kept her distance, caught somewhere between loyalty to her husband and disbelief over everything that had come to light. But she called one evening, tentatively, cautiously, and asked if we could talk. We met at a small cafe near McDowell Road, a quiet place with low lighting and classical music playing softly in the background. She wore beige slacks and a simple blouse, her hair pinned back the way she always did when she wanted to look composed. "I'm not here to defend him," she said after we ordered. I need to understand." I stirred my tea, watching the steam curl upward. Understand what? Why now? Why that way? Why make it public? I looked at her for a long moment. Because he never would have listened any other way, and because I was done being silent for the sake of everyone else's comfort. She nodded slowly, her hands folded tightly on the table. "You know he was raised to believe emotion was weakness. His father—" "I know," I interrupted gently. "But I wasn't raised by his father. I was raised by him, and he had a choice. Every day, he had a choice." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "He still doesn't talk about it. Not really. He stays in his study most days, reads, watches old movies, pretends it never happened. That's his choice too," I said. "But I'm not pretending anymore." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "I don't know how to fix any of this." "You don't have to fix it," I told her. "You just have to stop pretending it was never broken." She nodded again. And for the first time, there was something honest in her expression. Not just sadness, but accountability. We never spoke much about it again, but that meeting marked a shift between us, a subtle thawing of years of unspoken things. As for Jeremy, we remained estranged. He sent a curt email a few months later, something about how he couldn't understand how I could betray our family like that. I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I was done writing letters to people who refused to read them. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when I questioned everything, when I woke up with a weight on my chest or heard a voice in my head echoing old doubts. I still flinched when someone raised their voice in a meeting. I still hesitated before presenting bold ideas, instinctively bracing for criticism. But the difference now was that I recognized those reactions. I named them. I didn't let them dictate my choices. I began seeing a therapist, Dr. Elaine Corbett, a woman with kind eyes and an ability to ask questions that sliced through the noise. With her help, I unraveled years of internalized beliefs, that my worth was conditional, that my voice was too loud, that strength meant rejection. We worked through childhood memories, family dynamics, moments I had buried so deeply I wasn't sure they were even mine. One day she asked me, "When you think about your father now, what do you feel?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window of her office, watching the branches of a Palo Verde tree sway in the wind. Then I said, "Not hate, not even anger, just clarity." She smiled gently. "That's progress." I also started writing again, not for work, but for myself. Essays, journal entries, letters I never intended to send. I wrote about what it meant to be invisible in plain sight, about the rage and grief of being underestimated, about the quiet revolution of choosing yourself after years of self-abandonment. Some of those pieces I submitted to online magazines. A few were published. Readers reached out, women especially, saying they saw themselves in my words, that my story gave them permission to confront their own, that, more than anything, made me feel whole. My definition of success shifted too. It wasn't just about building a business or proving something anymore. It was about creating space, for myself, for others, for truth. I started mentoring young women in the industry, especially those who struggled to be heard. I spoke at 2 conferences, one on entrepreneurship, one on emotional resilience. Standing on those stages, I thought about how my father had once used the spotlight to diminish me. And now, here I was, using it to amplify others. And then, one evening, almost a year after the awards ceremony, I received a letter. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed, formal. The envelope was cream-colored, addressed simply to Hannah Preston. The return address was familiar. It was from my father. I sat with it for hours before opening it. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange blend of expectation and uncertainty. Inside, the letter was brief, 3 paragraphs. No apology, but something close. He wrote that he had watched the video a dozen times, that he had read the article, the comments, the backlash, that he understood now, at least in part, the impact of his choices, not just on his career, but on his daughter. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even express regret the way most people would expect, but he acknowledged something he never had before. "I see now," he wrote, "that strength takes many forms, and that I mistook yours for defiance. I was wrong. That was all. And it was enough. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Because the letter wasn't for reconciliation, it was for recognition. A long-delayed mirror finally held up to the truth. In the end, I didn't get the father I always wanted, but I became the woman I needed to be. I stopped looking for belonging in people who couldn't see me. I stopped minimizing myself to fit into the spaces others made small. I built new rooms, opened new doors, lit new fires. And every time someone tried to shrink me again, I remembered exactly who I was. The daughter who rose from silence. The woman who rewrote the ending. It was almost exactly 1 year to the day after the Legacy Awards when the final storm arrived. By then, I had settled into a rhythm. My business was thriving. I had developed a circle of supportive colleagues and creative partners, and I had come to terms with the silence that remained between my father and me. We were not at war, not exactly. We had become something quieter, Parallel lives that once intersected violently and now simply ran beside each other, far enough apart that we no longer collided. But just as I began to think the worst had passed, the real reckoning began. I was driving home from a late client meeting in Phoenix when my phone rang. I nearly ignored it, unknown number, but something nudged me to pick up. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but calm, professional. He introduced himself as Agent Martin Conley with the Arizona Department of Revenue. My heart dropped. "We're reaching out as part of a continuing investigation into financial activities related to Douglas Preston," he said. "We're aware of your prior involvement in exposing related information and would like to request a formal interview." I pulled into a gas station and parked. My hands were trembling slightly. Not from guilt, I had nothing to hide, but from the weight of what this call meant. This was no longer a media scandal or a family dispute. This was legal. This was real. I agreed to meet him the following week. The interview took place in a bland government office in downtown Scottsdale. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the air was cold enough to make my fingers ache. Agent Conley was patient and thorough. He asked about the ledgers I had found, how I'd accessed them, who else had seen them, whether I had known about the misconduct before I released the information. I answered every question truthfully. At the end, he thanked me and said something that stuck with me. "We've seen a lot of whistleblowers, but it's rare to see someone do it to a family member. That takes a different kind of courage." I didn't respond, just nodded, because it wasn't about courage. Not really. It was about survival. And sometimes when survival demands it, you burn the bridge behind you so you can never be tempted to cross back. 2 weeks later, the news broke. My father had been formally charged with tax fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The investigation had expanded beyond state authorities and was now being pursued federally. His assets were being frozen. Subpoenas were issued. Former business partners were being called in for questioning. The mask he had worn for decades had finally shattered. I watched it unfold from my living room, curled on the couch with a mug of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink. The TV anchor spoke his name like it belonged to a stranger, dissecting his downfall with the detached efficiency of the evening news. I felt no joy, no triumph, just gravity. Like the earth had shifted under me and I was still waiting to regain my balance. My mother called again that night. This time her voice was frayed and brittle. "They came to the house," she said. "Took his computers, his files, everything." I could hear her breathing, heavy and uneven. I imagined her standing in the same foyer where I used to leave my school shoes, her world collapsing in slow motion. "He's not saying much," she added, "but he's different, quiet." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I knew how much it hurt to lose your illusions. She had lived in his shadow even longer than I had. A week later, I received a certified letter. It was a notice informing me that I might be called to testify, not just as the person who exposed the misconduct, but potentially as a key witness in the case. My stomach turned, not with fear, but with the realization that this chapter of my life wasn't over. Not yet. I would have to walk into a courtroom, raise my hand, and speak the truth in front of strangers, and maybe even him. The trial date was set for late October. The build-up to it was surreal. I was deposed by attorneys, walked through timelines again and again, each detail dissected and examined. I was told to expect character attacks, subtle or otherwise. My father's legal team would do everything they could to discredit me, paint me as vindictive or unstable or emotionally compromised. I didn't flinch. I had lived through worse. Words didn't scare me anymore. On the day of my testimony, I wore a navy blue suit and low heels. No jewelry except a thin silver bracelet I'd had since college. My hair was pulled back. I looked composed, professional, nothing like the messy daughter who had once cried in her bedroom wondering why her father couldn't love her the way she needed. That girl was gone. The woman in her place was clear-eyed and steady. When I entered the courtroom, my father was already seated at the defense table. He didn't look at me. He stared ahead, jaw clenched, hands folded tightly in front of him. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me now, the daughter who betrayed him, or the daughter he created through years of silence. The prosecutor guided me through my testimony. I described the ledgers, the storage unit, the timing of my discoveries. I explained how I had verified the information before going public, how I had worked with a journalist to ensure accuracy, how I had never accepted any compensation for the story. I spoke calmly, clearly, letting the truth speak for itself. And then it was the defense's turn. Their attorney, a sharp-eyed man with a silk tie and the confidence of someone used to winning, stood up and approached. "Ms. Preston," he began, "you've testified that you released this information as an act of conscience. But isn't it true that you had a long-standing history of conflict with your father?" "Yes," I said. "We had a difficult relationship. And would you describe that relationship as resentful?" I paused for a beat. "I would describe it as painful, not resentful." He nodded, flipping through a folder. "You claim your actions weren't motivated by revenge, but you timed your release for maximum public embarrassment. Isn't that right?" "I timed it for maximum visibility," I replied, "because for years the truth had been buried under his reputation. I wanted to make sure it was finally seen." He smirked slightly. "And yet, the truth also served to humiliate him. Wouldn't a private report to authorities have accomplished the same thing?" "No," I said, voice firm, "because private reports disappear. They get delayed, buried. I needed the public to pay attention. I needed the silence to break." There was a murmur in the room. The judge called for order. The defense attorney frowned, sensing that he wasn't swaying the jury the way he'd hoped. He tried a few more angles, but I didn't waver. Every answer I gave was the product of hard-won clarity. I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to be truthful. When my testimony ended, I stepped down and walked past my father. For a split second, our eyes met. And for the first time, I didn't see a titan or a monster or a mystery. I saw a man. Small, aging, tired. The empire he'd built now dust at his feet. The legacy he tried to shape now rewritten in headlines and transcripts. He didn't speak. Neither did I. But in that silence, I understood something. This wasn't just my reckoning. It was his too. And maybe the worst punishment wasn't prison or disgrace. Maybe it was knowing that the daughter he had tried to silence had become the one voice he couldn't escape. The trial continued for several more days. I wasn't present for the verdict, but I read about it the moment it was released. Guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing to follow. And with that, the final domino fell. When the verdict came through, I was alone in my office. The windows were open to let in the late October breeze, and the warm Arizona sun was casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I had been expecting the outcome, but when the notification lit up my phone, Douglas Preston found guilty on multiple charges, I still felt a tightening in my chest. It was final. The man who once stood untouchable in the real estate world of Scottsdale, who had spent his life crafting a legend around his name, was now officially a criminal. The justice system had spoken, and so had I. The news spread fast. Headlines danced across news sites, morning talk shows covered the story, and opinion pieces began dissecting his fall from grace. Some praised me for my courage. Others criticized the way I had brought the truth to light, accusing me of betrayal or sensationalism. But I didn't engage. Not anymore. I didn't owe the world an explanation. I had told my truth. The consequences belonged to him. Sentencing was scheduled for December. I chose not to attend. I didn't need to hear the exact number of years he'd spend behind bars, or listen to lawyers trade words over remorse and reputation. I had already heard the only sentence that mattered when the judge declared him guilty. That was the real end. Everything after was just formality. The week after the sentencing, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was short, just 6 words. "I'm sorry for how I failed." I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure whether to respond. It had taken him a year, a courtroom, and a shattered empire to string those words together. And yet, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel moved. The words felt like an afterthought, one final attempt to rewrite the story. But I wasn't in that chapter anymore. I deleted the message without replying. Around that time, my mother began the process of quietly separating her finances from his. She moved into a smaller house on the other side of town, something modest but warm. A garden, soft furniture, silence she could actually enjoy. She and I started seeing each other more often. At first, it was cautious. shared meals with polite conversation. But over time, a kind of tenderness returned. It was strange to rebuild a relationship with someone who had once stood quietly beside your pain, but I saw in her something I hadn't before: resilience. She had lived under his rule for decades and was only now beginning to unlearn it. She started painting again, soft watercolors of desert scenes and blooming cactus flowers. Sometimes she even laughed. One afternoon, while we were sitting in her backyard watching the sun dip behind the orange horizon, she turned to me and said, "You saved me too, you know." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and squeezed her hand. Not everything needed words. As winter crept in, my business continued to grow. I hired 2 more employees and was invited to speak at a national conference for women in leadership. I told my story, not the courtroom drama or the betrayal, but the personal journey, how I went from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. I talked about boundaries, about pain, about the long, hard road to self-ownership. People came up to me after with tears in their eyes, saying they saw themselves in my story. That's what mattered most to me, not the headlines, but the hearts. In late November, I received an email from a publishing house in New York. They had read some of my essays, especially the ones I had published under a pen name. They wanted to know if I had ever considered writing a memoir. I stared at the message in awe. For so long, I had buried my voice, dimmed my light to fit into a family that only celebrated one kind of success. And now, someone wanted to hear my full story, not as a whisper, but as a book. I took a week to think about it. I sat in coffee shops with a notebook, scribbling out chapter ideas. I revisited old journal entries, letters I had never sent, fragments of memories I had locked away, and then I replied yes. I signed a contract 2 weeks later and began working with an editor named Clara, who understood immediately what I wanted the book to be. Not a revenge tale, not a scandal story, but a reckoning, a testimony to the power of reclaiming your narrative. As I began writing, I found myself healing even more deeply. There was something about putting it all down, honestly, without shame, that brought new clarity. I realized I had carried my father's voice in my head for most of my life, but now my voice was louder and stronger. One evening, I came across an old family photo buried at the bottom of a drawer. It was taken when I was 12. My father stood tall in the center, arms crossed, his expression proud and serious. My mother beside him, smiling softly. Jeremy was grinning, crooked teeth and all. And then there was me, off to the side, half turned away from the camera, eyes already distant. I stared at the girl in that photo for a long time. I wanted to reach back and whisper to her, "You're going to be okay. You'll rise. You'll roar. He won't define you." I didn't keep the photo. I let it go. A few days before Christmas, I received a letter. A real one this time. Handwritten, on thick stationery. It was from one of my father's former colleagues, someone I barely remembered from company parties and charity events. His handwriting was elegant, old school. The letter was long, but one line stood out. "What you did took more strength than any of us ever had. You didn't just expose the truth, you lived it. You reminded all of us what integrity really looks like." I cried after reading it, not because I needed validation, but because I hadn't realized how much it still meant to be seen, not just as a daughter or a whistleblower, but as a whole person, someone who had survived the fire and still chose to build something from the ashes. On Christmas Eve, my mother and I made dinner together. Nothing extravagant, just baked salmon, roasted vegetables, and a warm pie she had learned to make from a neighbor. As we sat at the table, soft music playing in the background, she looked up at me and said, "I think your father's going to serve time." I nodded. I figured, I don't know how to feel about it. "It's okay not to know," I said. "You're allowed to feel everything, or nothing." She smiled at that. "I still remember the way he used to hold your hand when you were little. He was better at being a father before he became a man obsessed with legacy." I took a sip of wine and let her words settle. We all change. Some for the better, some not. She reached across the table and touched my arm. "But you changed and still became more of yourself." That night, I went home and sat by the window, watching the stars over the quiet Scottsdale sky. A year ago, I had walked into a banquet hall hoping to be acknowledged. I left that night in pieces, but now I was whole. Not because anyone gave me permission, but because I finally claimed it for myself. My father's fall wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. And whatever came next, whether more recognition or more resistance, I was ready. Because the girl who had once been ashamed to speak had become the woman unafraid to be heard. And no matter what they called me, daughter, traitor, truth-teller, I knew who I was. I was Hannah Preston, and this was just the start. 2 years later, I stood in a bookstore in downtown Phoenix, watching a line of strangers form beneath a banner that read, Hannah Preston, author of The House I Burned Down. The title had been Clara's suggestion. At first, I thought it was too dramatic. But the more I wrote, the more I realized it wasn't about fire in the literal sense. It was about liberation, about taking the structure someone else built for your life, the one that confined and silenced and twisted you, and choosing to light the match. The house had to burn so I could breathe. The release of the book had been quieter than the headlines that once filled every screen. There were no viral videos this time, no scandal chasing the words, just a story told in my own voice, on my own terms. And people responded. Women wrote me letters. Teachers shared the book with students. Even therapists told me they were recommending it to clients. I never expected the reach it would have, but there it was, spreading quietly, honestly, like a flame that warmed instead of consumed. As I signed copies that night, I saw someone familiar near the end of the line. A woman in a cream-colored coat, her silver hair tucked into a scarf, her hands folded tightly around a book. It took me a moment to recognize her. My father's former assistant, Delia. She had worked for him for over 20 years, always the picture of discretion and loyalty. She had been there through the rise and quietly faded into the background when he fell. When she reached the table, she didn't say much, just placed the book down and looked at me with eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. Not pity, not sorrow, something closer to admiration. You did what no one else could, she said, her voice low. He was powerful, but you were braver. I signed her copy with a steady hand. Thank you for saying that. As she turned to leave, she paused and added, He reads it, you know. Your book. I don't think he wants anyone to know, but he does. I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't need to. Some truths carry their own confirmation. My father was still serving his sentence. He'd been placed in a low-security federal facility, the kind of place that looked more like a campus than a prison. My mother visited him once, out of obligation more than anything. She came back quiet and pale, telling me only, he's smaller now, like the weight of it all finally settled. I never visited, not because I hated him. I didn't. But because I had said everything I needed to, and I didn't want to step back into the room where I'd once begged to be seen. Instead, I moved forward. My business continued to thrive. We opened a second location in Austin, and I hired a creative director to help me manage the growing workload. I taught a few workshops, mentored interns, and even returned to the university where I once studied to give a guest lecture. Life had opened up in ways I never thought possible. Not because I had destroyed something, but because I had rebuilt. Jeremy and I hadn't spoken in over a year. He'd moved to Colorado, started his own real estate firm. I occasionally heard about him through mutual acquaintances. He was doing well, respected, careful to avoid the shadow our father had cast. I sent him a signed copy of the book when it came out. No inscription, just the title page. He never responded, and I didn't expect him to. But I hoped that, in some quiet moment, he would read it and understand what he'd never let himself see. My mother, on the other hand, had become a constant in my life. We had dinner every Sunday, sometimes cooking together, sometimes ordering takeout and watching old films. She was softer now. She spoke more freely. She asked questions about my work, about my life, about who I was becoming. It was like she had stepped out from behind a curtain she hadn't even known she'd been standing behind. One evening, as we sat on her patio sipping wine, she asked, "Do you ever think about what things might have been like if your father had been different?" I didn't answer right away. I watched the stars emerging one by one above us, the desert sky wide and endless. "Sometimes," I said, "but not the way I used to. I don't dream about the version of him who would have loved me better. I think about the version of me who thought she needed that. She looked at me with eyes glistening. "You've grown so much." "I had to," I said. There was no other way forward. And there wasn't. Sometimes I would walk past familiar places in Scottsdale, restaurants we once went to, the church where my parents used to volunteer, the park where Jeremy and I played as kids. The past lived in those places, but it no longer haunted me. It was just a part of the map, not the terrain I walked every day. I received another letter from my father 6 months before he was scheduled for parole. This one was longer, reflective. He wrote about the nights he couldn't sleep, about the books he was reading, about the silence that forced him to look inward. He didn't beg for forgiveness, but he did something I never expected. He asked what it had cost me, not what I had done, but what I had endured. That shift in language, that acknowledgement, was more powerful than any apology could have been. I never wrote back. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to open a new chapter with him. The story between us was complete, not perfect, not reconciled, but whole, in its own broken way. As time moved on, I found myself drawn to quieter things. Hiking in the early mornings, journaling, hosting small dinners with people who saw me fully. I adopted a dog, a golden retriever mix named Olive, who followed me around with endless loyalty and had a habit of resting her head on my feet whenever I wrote. One night, as I sat by the fire pit behind my house, Olive curled beside me. I opened the first printed copy of my second book. It was titled, Unspoken: What We Carry When Silence Ends. This one wasn't about my father. It was about everything else: grief, freedom, identity, the echoes of family, and how we learn to outgrow the echoes without forgetting the sound. I dedicated it to the girl I used to be, who kept going, even when the world taught her to stop. The launch was quieter than the first. No interviews, no buzz, just shelves lined with words, and a slow stream of readers who found themselves in its pages. That was enough for me. Now, when people ask me what I do, I say, I build things. Brands, books, bridges between past and present. I don't say daughter anymore. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I've outgrown the need to define myself through anyone else's lens. I am Hannah Preston, a builder of my own world, a storyteller, a woman who once gave a man his final gift, not out of hate, but out of truth. And when I look back on that moment, standing in that banquet hall, heart pounding as my father dismissed me for the last time, I no longer feel the sting. I feel the shift. The moment I realized I wasn't meant to sit at someone else's table. I was meant to build my own. That night, as the fire crackled and the desert wind whispered through the Palo Verde trees, I whispered something to myself that I wish I'd known long ago. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were simply waiting for the day you'd stop asking for permission to exist. And that day had come. Have you ever stood up to someone in your family, even when it meant risking everything? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your voice. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more powerful journeys of truth, healing, and self-discovery. And if you know someone who needs to remember their worth, send this video to them. Sometimes it's not about revenge, it's about finally choosing yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. Never forget, your truth deserves to be heard.